Welcome to the Ultimate Django course. In this course, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about Django, from the very basics to more advanced concepts. So by the end of this course, you'll be able to use Django to build production-grade backends for your web and mobile apps. If you have always wanted to learn web development with Python, you are in the right place. We'll use Python and Django to build and deploy the backend for an e-commerce application. If you're looking for a comprehensive, organized, and practical course that takes you from zero to hero and prepares you for the job, this is the right Django course for you. Everything you need to know about Django is in one place in the right order, so you don't need to jump back and forth between random tutorials. I'm Mosh Hamedani, and I've taught millions of people how to advance their software engineering skills through my YouTube channel and online school, codewithmosh.com. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe as I upload new videos all the time. Now let's jump in and get started. Let's talk about what you need to know to take this course. For starters, you need to know Python. You need to know the basics of Python, as well as object-oriented programming concepts such as classes, inheritance, polymorphism, and so on. You should also know the basics of relational databases, so you should be familiar with concepts such as tables, columns, primary and foreign keys, relationships, and so on. If you need to refresh the fundamentals, I have a couple of beginner-level tutorials on my YouTube channel, as well as comprehensive courses on my website, codewithmosh.com. I've put the links down below in case you're interested. Alright, so I'm assuming that you're the right student for this course. Now let's talk about how you should take this course. First and foremost, I want you to watch this entire course all the way from the beginning to the end, even if you're familiar with Django, because along the way, I will share a lot of tips and tricks, and I don't want you to miss out on any of them. If you have taken any of my other courses, you know that I'm not going to waste your time with repetitive or useless stuff. So make sure to watch every lesson. Now, while watching each lesson, I want you to take notes. You can just write down some keywords on a piece of paper if you don't want to write a lot of notes. I strongly believe that the act of writing things down will help you remember new things that you learn. Then, after each lesson, go through your notes and repeat the same steps I show you in the video. This is exactly how I personally learn new things. Also, I've carefully designed tons of exercises that help you understand and remember the materials. So make sure to do all these exercises, because the more you practice, the better you'll be at Django or coding in general. Welcome back to the Ultimate Django course. In this section, we're going to talk about the basics of Django. First, I will give you a quick introduction to what Django is and why it's so popular. Then we'll talk about the fundamental web development concepts that every web developer must know. Next, we'll set up our machine for development and create our first Django project. Once that project is up and running, I will show you 2 essential techniques for debugging Django applications. This is going to be a short and sweet introduction to Django, so let's jump in and get started. So what is Django and why is it so popular? Well, Django is a free and open source framework for building web applications with Python. It's not the only web framework for Python, but it's the most popular one, because it helps us build a website in less time with fewer lines of code. That's why a lot of companies like YouTube, Instagram, Spotify, and Dropbox use Django in their tech stack. Now, Django is what we call a batteries included framework, which means it comes with a lot of features out of the box, so we don't have to code them from scratch. For example, it gives us an admin interface for managing our data, which is a huge time saver. It also has an object relational mapper that abstracts a database so we can query or persist data without writing a lot of SQL code. It also comes with an authentication package for identifying users. It also has a package for caching data and much more. So since Django offers all these amazing features, we can focus on our application and its requirements. We don't have to reinvent the wheel and code all these features from scratch. Now, once in a while, you might come across someone like our popular superstar developer, John Smith, who thinks Django is a piece of crap because it's old and bloated with so many features. He used it, hated it, and then rewrote his entire project with a new shiny framework that is faster. Well, saying a framework is better than Django because it's faster is kind of like saying a Ferrari is better than a truck because it's faster. What if you want to move something? You're not going to use your Ferrari for that, right? So a wise software engineer doesn't pick up a framework merely based on its performance. There are so many other things you need to take into account, like the maturity of the framework, how stable it is from one version to another, its learning curve, the size of the community, and so on. Django has been around for a long time and it has a huge community. So there are tons of Django packages built by the community that you can reuse in your applications. Also, if you get stuck, there's always someone out there to help you. If you want to hire people, there are tons of people to choose from. So these are the benefits of having a huge community around a framework. Now, regarding Django features, yes, Django comes with a lot of features, but you don't have to use or even learn all of them because all these features are optional. So you can use the features that make sense for your own application. So in my opinion, debates about the best framework in the world are useless. We all like different things, and just because someone doesn't like Django, it doesn't mean it's bad. A lot of companies are using Django and are looking for Django developers. Here in the US, the average salary of a Django developer is just over $117,000 a year. So if you like Python and want to get into web development, learning Django is a good investment for your future. So you learned that Django is a framework for building web applications with Python. Now let's talk about some of the fundamental concepts you need to understand to build web applications. Let's say we're going to build an online store and publish it at moshbuy.com. Now this website is going to have two parts or two applications, a front end and a back end. The front end is the part that is loaded inside a web browser on a client machine. It's the part that the user sees and interacts with. The backend is the part that runs on a web server and is responsible for data processing, validating business rules, and so on. Now let's imagine that Alice wants to visit our website. So she points her browser to moshbuy.com. This address is also called a URL, which is short for Uniform Resource Locator. It's basically a way to locate a resource on our internet. A resource can be a web page, an image, a video, a PDF, and so on. So Alice types moshbuy.com in her browser and presses enter. At this moment, her browser sends a request to the web server that hosts our website and says, hey, Alice wants to see the homepage. So the web server should take this request, process it, and return a response back to the client. This data exchange is defined by a protocol called HTTP, which is short for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It defines how clients and servers can communicate. So this is the big picture. As Alice navigates our website, for each page, her browser sends an HTTP request to the server and receives an HTTP response. Now, as part of building the backend for this website, we need to decide how we're going to respond to clients. One option is to generate the requested page on the server and return it to the client. We use HTML for that. HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. It's a simple language for representing web pages and their content. Every web page we have seen on our internet is built using HTML. So one option is to generate the page on the server and return an HTML document to the client. The other option is to return only the data needed on the requested page and have the client generate the page. So instead of putting a complete page or a complete HTML document in an HTTP response, we only return the data like the list of products. Now, what is the difference? Well, if we push this responsibility to the client, we can free up the server so it can serve more clients. Our application will be more scalable. That's why over the past few years, this approach has become more trendy and is now considered the industry best practice. These days, we have tools like React, Angular, and Vue for generating web pages on the client. These are all client-side tools that are used by front-end developers. In contrast, we have server-side tools for building backends. Django falls in this category, so you should not compare Django with, let's say, React. You may compare Django with other server-side frameworks like ASP.NET Core, which is used by C# developers, Express, used by JavaScript developers, and so on. So if we push the responsibility of generating web pages to the client, the server essentially becomes a gateway to the data. On the server, we can provide endpoints that the client can talk to get or save various pieces of data. For example, we can provide one endpoint to get the list of products and another endpoint to get the list of orders someone has placed. Now, all these endpoints together represent the interface that clients use to talk to the server. In technical terms, we say the server provides an API or an application programming interface to clients. This API is essentially like the buttons on a remote control. All these buttons together represent the interface or the API we use to interact with the TV, okay? So in this course, our focus will be on using Django to build an API for our online store. Client applications can use this API to get or save the data. How these clients are built is irrelevant here. We can use React, Angular, or even plain JavaScript. That falls under front-end development, which has nothing to do with Django. Once we build this API, if you know front-end development, you can always build a client app that talks to this API. All right, now that you understand the big picture, we are ready to set up our development environment. And that's what we will do next. All right, let's make sure you have the right setup before we start coding. The first thing I want you to do is upgrade your Python to the latest version. So head over to python.org/downloads and download the latest version of Python for your operating system. Once you do that, then open up your terminal window and run python --version to make sure you have upgraded your Python correctly. Now here we see Python 2.7. Because on Mac, we have two different versions of Python running side by side. We have the old Python 2, which is now deprecated, and we also have Python 3. So if you're using a Mac, you have to run Python 3 --version. But if you're on Windows or Linux, you have to run Python --version, okay? So here I'm using Python 3.9.5, great. Next, we're going to use pip or pip3 if you're on Mac to install pipenv. I talked about pipenv in my Python course. It's basically a dependency management tool for installing our application dependencies in virtual environments. This way, our application dependencies will not clash with other applications' dependencies, okay? So let's go ahead and install this. Now in this course, just like my other courses, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code or VS Code as my editor. It's just my personal preference. If you have a preference for a different tool like PyCharm, that's totally fine. Having said that, I highly encourage you to use VS Code because throughout the course, I'm going to show you a lot of shortcuts and time-saving tips that will not apply to your editor. In case you don't have VS Code, you can get it from code.visualstudio.com. Now, once you run it, I want you to go to the extensions panel over here and search for Python. Make sure to install this extension because with this, we get features such as IntelliSense, debugging, code navigation, and so on. All right, now that we have installed all the necessary tools, let's create our first Django project. So here in the terminal window, I'm going to go to my desktop. You can go anywhere on your machine. It doesn't really matter. Now we're going to create a directory called storefront. That is the name of our project. Next, we go inside this directory and run pipenv install Django. So we're going to install Django using pipenv inside a virtual environment. Now, let's go ahead. All right, now take a look. So over here, you can see that pipenv has created a virtual environment for this project. Down below, you can see the path to this virtual environment. Now, if you're on Windows, you're going to see something like C drive / whatever. Now, if you're on a Mac and using Z shell, which is this fancy, colorful terminal window, you can hold down the command key and click on this path to go into it. Otherwise, you can just copy this and use the cd command to go inside this directory. Now, take a look. So here's our virtual environment. In this environment, we have this bin folder that contains a bunch of binaries. For example, we have Python, pip, Django admin, and so on. So back to the terminal, pipenv created a virtual environment and installed Django inside that environment. But in addition to this, pipenv also created two files in this directory, pipfile and pipfile.log. So I'm going to open this directory using Visual Studio Code by running code period. If this doesn't work on your machine, just drag and drop this folder onto VS Code. All right, so here's our pip file. This is like package.json for JavaScript projects. So in this file, we can see that our project needs this particular version of Python. And under packages, you can see the packages that our application is dependent upon. So here we have Django equals asterisk. That means any version or the latest version of Django. If we installed a particular version of Django, we would see that version here. Now back to the terminal window, we need to activate this virtual environment, so we'll use the Python interpreter inside this virtual environment, not the one that is installed globally on this machine. To do that, we're going to run pipenv shell. Okay. Next, we're going to use Django admin to start a new project. Django admin is a utility that comes with Django. So if you run it, we can see all these commands that we can use to work with Django projects. As we go through the course, you'll become familiar with these commands. In this lesson, we're going to use Django admin start project, and we're going to call that project storefront. Now back to VS Code, Django admin created this directory for our project. And inside this directory, it created another directory that is the core of our application. In this directory, we have these files, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But before I do so, let's get rid of this redundancy because we have 3 storefront directories. The top one is the one that we created earlier in the terminal. And then we have these 2 other directories, one for the project, one for the core of our application. So I'm going to delete this project directory. Now we're back in the previous step. So we don't have a Django project at this stage. Now, back in the terminal, let's bring up the last command, but type a period at the end. This tells Django to use the current directory as the project directory. So Django is not going to create an additional directory for our project. Okay, now take a look. So we have this directory, which is the core of our application. In this directory, we have this init file, which defines this directory as a package. We have this settings module where we define our application settings. We have the URLs module where we define the URLs of our application. And these 2 other modules that are used for deployment. For now, don't worry about them. Now, next to this directory, we have this file manage.py. This is a wrapper around Django admin. So going forward, instead of Django admin, we're going to use manage.py. The reason for this is that manage.py takes the settings of this project into account. Let me show you what I mean. So now that we have a project, we want to run a web server. So another command that Django admin provides is run server. However, if we run Django admin, run server, we get an error saying requested setting debug, but settings are not configured because at this point, Django admin doesn't know about the settings of our project. So now that we have a project, instead of Django admin, we're going to run python manage.py. Now look, we see the same commands that Django admin provides. So here we can say python manage.py run server. Now optionally, we can supply a port number. If we don't supply this, by default, this will use port 8000, but you might have another application running on port 8000. In that case, you might want to explicitly set the port number. So let's go ahead with that. Now we don't get an error because manage.py knows about the settings of our project. Now here we get this warning saying you have 18 unapplied migrations. Don't worry about this yet. We'll talk about this soon. So if you look over here, you can see that Django has started a development server at this address. So we can copy this and paste it into browser, or if you're on a Mac and using Z Shell, you can hold down the command key and click this. All right, beautiful. Our first Django project is running successfully. So let's move on to the next lesson. So far, I've been using a separate terminal window, but VS Code also has an integrated terminal window that is easier to use. But to use that, we have to properly configure it to use the Python interpreter inside our virtual environment. Let me show you how to do this. So back to our terminal window. First, we're going to stop the web server by pressing Ctrl and C. Okay. Now back in VS Code, on the top, under the View menu, look, we have this command palette. The shortcut on Mac is Shift, Command, and P. Now here we're going to search for Python interpreter. So currently, VS Code is using this Python interpreter that is installed globally on this machine. We don't want to use this. We want to use the one inside our virtual environment. But how can we find the path to our virtual environment? Very easy. So back to the terminal, let's run pipenv --venv. All right, here's the path. So let's copy this. Good. Now back to VS Code. We're going to select interpreter path. Then we're going to paste the path and append /bin/Python at the end. If you're on Windows, instead of a /, you have to use a \. Okay. Good. Now, in this project, we have an extra directory, VS Code. We have a settings file. And here we have the path to a Python interpreter. Good. With this, we can go to the view menu. Now look, we have this integrated terminal. The shortcut on Mac is Control and Backtick. Now VS Code automatically activates the virtual environment for this project. So here we can run Python manage.py run server. Good. So going forward, I'm going to use the integrated terminal window here. It's easier. We can always hide it by pressing Control and Backtick or bring it back. We can maximize it, move it around, and so on. Now, one quick tip. Sometimes when running this command, you might get a syntax error saying invalid syntax. This happens every now and then when VS Code fails to activate the virtual environment for this project. To solve this problem, all you have to do is open a new terminal window, and look, VS Code executed this command to activate the virtual environment for this project. Now we can run Python manage.py run server. Great. Hey guys, Mosh here. I just wanted to let you know that this tutorial you have been watching is actually the first hour of my Ultimate Django course. The complete course is about 10 hours and goes way beyond this tutorial. So if you're serious about learning Django and are looking for a job as a backend developer, I highly encourage you to enroll in the course. The course comes with tons of exercises and solutions, a full e-commerce project that you will eventually deploy to the cloud, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee and a certificate of completion you can add to your resume. In case you're interested, I'll put the link down below. And if not, that's totally fine. Let's move on to the next lesson. All right, let's talk about apps. So every Django project is essentially a collection of various apps, each providing certain functionality. Just like the apps on your mobile phone, each app provides a certain functionality, right? Django projects are exactly the same. So in this project, let's open up the storefront directory and then look at our settings module. Now we can collapse this panel by pressing Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. Okay. Now in this module, we have a bunch of different settings. In this lesson, we're going to look at the install apps. So every Django project by default includes these apps. The first app is the admin app, which gives us an admin interface for managing our data. Then we have the auth app, which is used for authenticating users. Then we have content types app, which we'll talk about later in the course. Next, we have the sessions app, which is kind of legacy. We don't use sessions anymore. A session is a temporary memory on the server for managing users' data. These days, when building APIs with Django, we don't use the sessions app. So we can come here and delete this app. Then we have the messages app, which is used for displaying one-time notifications to the user. And finally, we have the static files app for serving static files like images, CSS files, and so on. So each app provides a certain piece of functionality, okay? Now we can also create our own apps here. So let's save this file. Now let's open up the terminal window by pressing Control and Backtick. So here's our terminal window where we have our development server running. We're going to open a new terminal window. Okay, now let's expand this. To clear the window, we simply press Control and L. Now we're going to run Python manage.py start app, and we're going to call this app Playground. Okay, so let's close this window and open up the Explorer panel. All right, look, here's our new app, which is represented using a folder with a special structure. So every Django app has the exact same structure. Here we have the migrations folder for generating database tables. We'll talk about that later in the course. We have a complete section about this topic. We have the admin module where we define how the admin interface for this app is going to look like. Next, we have the apps module where we configure this app. So the name is misleading. I don't know why Django developers decided to call this module apps. It would be better if it was called config. That's just my 2 cents. Next, we have the models module where we define the model classes for this app. We use model classes to pull out data from the database and present to the user. Next, we have the tests module where we write our unit tests. And finally, we have the views module, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Again, the name is misleading. This is not the view that you think if you come from a front-end development background. So what we have here is essentially a request handler. It's not a view. It doesn't have a template or HTML. Again, we'll talk about that in the next lesson. So we created a new app. Now we need to register this app in the settings module. So every time you create a new app, you need to register it here in the list of installed apps. We simply add the name of the app, which is called Playground. Save the changes, done. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about views. All right, let's talk about views. So earlier you learned that HTTP is a request response protocol. So every data exchange involves a request and a response. This is where we use views in Django. So here in the Playground folder, let's open up the views module. This is where we define our views or view functions. A view function is a function that takes a request and returns a response. So more accurately, it's a request handler. In some frameworks, it's called an action. In Django, it's called a view. But I don't agree with this name because from an architectural point of view, a view is often associated with something that the user sees. That part in Django is called a template, and we'll talk about that later in this section. Now, that aside, let's create our first view function. So we're going to create a function. We can call it anything we want. I'm going to call it, say, hello. Now, this function should take a request object and return a response. So first, on the top, from Django.http package, we're going to import the HTTP response class. Now, in this function, we can do anything we want. In a real-world scenario, we can pull data from a database, we can transform data, we can send emails, and so on. For now, let's just return a simple response. So we're going to return an instance of the HTTP response class. And in this object, in this response, you want to add a simple string. So let's say hello world. Okay, so this is our first view or first view function. Now we need to map this view to a URL. So when we get a request at that URL, this function will be called. And that's what we're going to do next. All right, here's our Django project. Now, let's say whenever we send a request to playground/hello, our view function should be called and return hello world to the user. Let's see how we can do that. So back to our project. Here in the Playground folder, we're going to add a new file called urls.py. We could call it anything. The name doesn't matter. But by convention, we call it URLs. Now, in this module, we're going to map our URLs to our view functions. So on the top, we're going to import the path function from Django.urls. So from Django.urls, we're going to import the path function. Now, don't worry about memorizing any of this. As you practice, all of this will become second nature. Also, from the current folder, we should import the views module so we can reference our view function. Now we should define a special variable called URL patterns, all in lowercase. Make sure to spell it properly because this is what Django looks for. We should set this to an array of URL pattern objects. We use the path function to create a URL pattern object. So if we call this function, look at the signature of this function. This function has a bunch of parameters. The first one is route, which is a string. The notation you see here is called type annotation, which is kind of a new feature in Python. With type annotation, we can see the type of parameters and the return value of a function. So the first parameter is route, which is a string. The second parameter is view, which is a function that returns HTTP response object. Now look over here. This notation represents the return type of this function. So the path function returns a URL pattern object. So I'm going to call this function and give it two arguments. A route or a URL, which is playground/hello, and a view function. So from the views module, we're going to get say hello. Note that I'm not calling this function, so here we don't have a pair of parentheses. We're just passing a reference to this function. Okay? So what we have here is called a URL conf module. That basically means URL configuration. So every app can have its own URL configuration. But now we need to import this URL configuration into the main URL configuration for this project. Where is it? You saw it earlier. So back to the Explorer panel. Here in the storefront folder, we have another URLs module. Up here, we have a bunch of comments about how we should use this module. Now look over here. If you want to include another URL conf, there are two things we need to do. First, we need to import the include function from Django.urls. So over here, we have from Django.urls. We're going to import the include function. Next, we need to add a URL to URL patterns. So in this module, we also have a URL patterns object, which is an array of URL patterns object. So here we're going to call path, give it a route, and then we use the include function to reference the URL configuration module in this app. So we're going to call path and say any URLs that start with playground followed by a / should be routed to our playground app. So this is where we use the include function. Now, the include function requires a parameter that is a string. Here we're going to reference playground.urls. So if we send a request to playground/hello, Django knows that all requests that start with playground should be handled by this app. So it's going to chop off the first part of this URL and pass the rest to the URL configuration module in the playground app. So back to this URLs module, we no longer need to add playground here because we added it once in the main URL configuration module. So we simply add hello followed by a /. I forgot to add that. We always end our routes with a /. So let's save the changes. Now, whenever we change our code, Django web server automatically restarts itself. So let's open up the terminal window. Make sure we don't have any errors. Good. So back to the browser. Let's send a request to this endpoint. Great. We see hello world on the screen. So this is how we can map URLs to view functions. Next, we're going to talk about templates. So I told you that views in Django are not really views. They're more like request handlers or actions. What we often call a view in other frameworks is called a template in Django. So let's see how we can use a template to return HTML content to the client. So here in the Playground app, we're going to add a new folder called templates. And in this folder, we're going to add a new file called hello.html. And of course, we could call it anything. And here we can write some HTML markup. For example, we can type H1 and press tab to add an H1 heading and say hello world. Now, don't worry if you don't know HTML, we're not going to use it in this course. I just want to show you how Django templates work. So let's save the changes. Now, back to our view function. Instead of returning a plain HTTP response, we're going to use the render function to render a template and return HTML markup to the client. So let's remove this line and call the render function. Now, look at the return type of this function. It returns an HTTP response object. So here we're going to return the response. Now, let's remove the brackets and type them again so we can see the function signature. The first parameter here is a request object, and the type of this is HTTP request. So we're going to pass this request object right here. Now the second parameter, that's the name of our template, which is a string. So here I'm going to say hello.html. The other parameters are optional, so don't worry about them at this point. Now, save the changes. Let's make sure our project works up to this point. So back in the browser, refresh, beautiful. Now we see HTML content. We can verify it by right-clicking on this page and looking at the page source. So look, we are returning HTML content. Great. Now, let's make this a bit more interesting. So back to our template. Instead of hello world, we can dynamically render some value. So back to our view function. Let's type a comma to see the next parameter. That is a context object, and the type of this is a mapping of string to any. That means we can pass any mapping object that maps a string value to any other type of object. So here we can pass a dictionary. So let's pass a dictionary. The type of the key should be a string, so we can call that name. And we're going to set that to a value like, let's say mosh. Now, back to our template. Instead of hello world, we can render the name that we passed here. So we type 2 pairs of braces, and in between, we type the name of the key. Save, refresh, beautiful. Now, in this template, we can also write some logic. So we can type an if statement. So we type braces, and in between them, we add 2 percentage signs. In between them, we can write an if statement. So we can say, if name is set, we can render it here. Otherwise, we can render hello world. And of course, we need an end if clause as well. So end if. Now, this syntax is kind of ugly, but the good thing about Django is that it's modular. So you can easily replace Django's default template engine with your preferred template engine. But once again, we don't really use templates in Django projects that often these days. There are special cases for them, but for the most part, we use Django to build APIs that return data, not HTML content. So I just included this lesson so you know what templates are and how they work. We're not going to spend any more time on templates for now, unless we encounter a situation where we really need them. Let's talk about debugging Django applications in VS Code. This is particularly useful if our application doesn't produce the right result and we want to run it line by line and see where exactly something has gone wrong. So click on this icon to open the Run and Debug panel. Now, the first time you see this message saying we should create a launch.json file. Basically, we need to create a launch profile so VS Code knows how to run or debug this application. So let's click on this. Now, in this list, select Django. All right, here's our launch.json file. What you see here is kind of like a dictionary in Python. We have a bunch of key value pairs. These key value pairs define a launch profile. So VS Code knows that to run this application, it should use the current Python interpreter to run manage.py, which exists in our workspace folder. And then as an argument, it should pass run server to it. Here we can add an additional argument to specify the port so it doesn't clash with port 8000, which is currently in use. Okay, save the changes. We're done with this file. So let's close it. Now, if you're curious, let me show you where this file exists. It's added to our project up here inside the VS Code folder. So here's our launch profile. Now that we have a launch profile, if we go to the Run and Debug panel, we see something else. So here we can start our application for debugging. But before doing so, I want to write some dummy code here in our view function. So let's set x to 1 and y to 2. Now I'm going to click on this line to insert a breakpoint. When we add a breakpoint, VS Code will execute every line of code until it hits our breakpoint. From that point onward, we can execute our code line by line. So let's add a breakpoint and then start the application for debugging. All right, let me collapse this window. Good. So in this new terminal window, we have a development server listening on port 9000. So let's hold down the command key on Mac or control on Windows and click on this link. All right, here's what we get. The homepage of our project is gone because we have registered a custom route that is playground/hello. So we see the homepage only the first time we run our Django project. So let's go to playground/hello. All right, our breakpoint is activated and we are on this line. Now on the left side, in the variables section, you can see the local variables. So currently we have the request object. That is the request object that we receive in this function. So we can expand it and inspect its various attributes. We don't want to do that for now. So let's close this. We want to execute our code line by line. So here we have a bunch of functions. The first one is step over, and the shortcut for this is F10. With this, we can step over the current line. So if we press F10, this line gets executed and now we are on the second line. Now look over here. In the list of local variables, we have x and its value is 1. This is very useful when debugging applications. So if something is not calculated properly, we can inspect it here. Now, most of the time you can see your local variables here, but if not, you can always add them in the watch window. So before recording this video, I was practicing. That's why you see X here. Let me select this and delete it. So in your watch section, you're not going to have any variables. To add one, we simply click on this and then type the name of our variable. Okay. So this is how we can step over various lines. So we can press F10 again and again. So this function is executed, and now back in the browser, we see the final result. Now let's do something more interesting. So back to our code. Let's close the terminal window so we have more space. I'm going to define a function here called calculate. And here we're going to set x to 1, y to 2, and return x. Just some dummy code. Now over here, we're going to call the calculate function. Okay. Now save the changes. Back in the browser, let's refresh. So our view function gets called. Now we are right here. Now this time, instead of stepping over this line, we want to step into it. Because if we step over this line, we're not going to see what happened in the calculate function. We see the final result. So we see x is set to 1, and we can verify that over here as well. But sometimes we need to step into a function to see what is happening there. Maybe there is a bug inside the calculate function. So let's restart the debugger. Okay, I'm going to close this. Back in the browser, let's refresh this page. Okay, we're back to this line. Now this time, we're going to step into this function. So look over here. This is the icon for stepping into a function. And as you can see, the shortcut is F11. So if you press F11, we go inside the calculate function. Now we can execute each line using F10 or step over and see where something has gone wrong. Now let's imagine this calculate function is a large function with a lot of code. At some point, we want to step out of it without having to execute every line of code in this function. There's a shortcut for this. So look over here. That is step out. The shortcut is Shift and F11. So if we press Shift and F11, we get back to the previous function. So this is how we can debug Django applications in VS Code. Now, once we're done, it's always a good practice to remove these breakpoints. Otherwise, they get in the way. So as you debug your applications, you place various breakpoints in different parts of your code, and you will hit them all the time. So always remove your breakpoints once you're done with them. So we're done with this debugging session. Now we can disconnect by pressing Shift and F5 or clicking on this icon. All right. Now, one last tip before we finish this lesson. On the top, under the Run menu, look, we have a command called Run Without Debugging. The shortcut on Mac is Control and F5. So if we use this shortcut, we can start our application without having to run Python manage.py run server. Let me show you what I mean. So first, let's bring up our terminal window. Here's the second terminal window that we use for debugging. I'm going to delete this. Here's the first terminal window where we started our application by running Python manage.py run server. So let's press Control and C to stop the server. Good. I'm also going to delete this terminal window. Let's imagine we just opened this project in VS Code, day one. Now, to run this application without debugging, we can press Control and F5. Now our application has started on port 9000. So we can go to this address and then hit playground/hello. So this is how we can run our application without debugging. Just remember that if you use this command, your breakpoints are not going to get hit. So if you want to debug your applications, you should start it in the debug mode. There is another way to debug Django applications using a powerful tool called Django Debug Toolbar. So if you go to Google and search for Django Debug Toolbar, you're going to find this page. Over here, you're going to find the installation instructions. So I highly encourage you to follow along with me and repeat the same steps so we install this toolbar together. So first we have to use pip or pipenv to install Django debug toolbar. So back to VS Code, I'm going to open up a new terminal window. And as you can see, VS Code used the source command to activate our virtual environment. So now let's run pip-env install Django-debug-toolbar. Good. Now back to the documentation. The next step is to add debug toolbar in the list of installed apps in our settings module. So back to VS Code, we can press Command and P on Mac or Control and P on Windows to bring up the search box. Now we search for our settings module. Good. Now in the list of installed apps, at the end, we're going to add debug _toolbar. Good. Now the next step. The next step is to add a new URL pattern in our main URL conf module. So I'm going to copy this line and back to VS Code. Let's bring up the URLs module. We're going to pick the one in the storefront folder. Okay. Now we add a comma here and paste that line. Now here we have a compilation error because debug toolbar is a module that we have to import on the top. So if you look at the documentation, you can see that over here, import debug toolbar. So copy this and paste it right here. Good. Now back to the documentation. The next step is to add a middleware. We use middleware to hook into Django's request response processing. So in our settings module, we have a setting for middleware. We're going to add this line in that file. So copy this. Back to the settings module. Here we have the install apps. Right after that, you can see the middleware setting. So we're going to add that on the top. Now the final step is to add our IP address in the internal IP setting. So for local development, we should use 127.0.0.1. So I'm going to copy this entire setting because by default, this doesn't exist in a new Django project. So copy this and we're going to paste it anywhere in this settings file. It doesn't really matter. Okay, save. So we have completed all the steps. Now back in the browser, if you go to this URL, playground/hello, we don't see the toolbar. It should appear here because the toolbar only appears when we return a proper HTML document. If you right click here and look at the page source, you can see that we are not returning a proper HTML document. So we don't have the HTML head and body elements. So let's open up hello.html. Now on the top, we type HTML, press tab. Now inside these elements, we're going to add a body. And then inside the body, we're going to add the code that we had earlier. So let's move that right here. Good. Now we have a proper HTML document. Of course, the head element is missing, but it doesn't really matter. Now back to the browser, refresh, and here's Django debug toolbar. Here we have different panels like history for seeing the URLs we have hit so far. We have versions to see the version of Django, Python, and debug toolbar we're running. We have processing time, we have our settings, we have request headers, and so on. Now, my personal favorite panel is the SQL or SQL panel. Here we can see the queries that are sent to the database. So later in the course, where we talk about querying the database using Django's object relational mapper, we're going to come back to this panel and see what queries Django will generate and send to the database. So that's it for this lesson. We're done with this section. In the next section, we're going to talk about building a data model. So I will see you in the next section. Welcome back to another section of the Ultimate Django course. In this section, we're going to talk about models which are used to store and retrieve data. We'll start off by a quick introduction to data modeling to make sure you know the essential concepts. Then we're going to design the data model for an e-commerce application. Next, we're going to talk about organizing our models in apps to improve reusability. This is one of the areas that is often misunderstood, so I'm going to demystify it once for all. And then we'll spend the rest of this section in coding model classes. We'll use these classes to store and retrieve data throughout the course. So let's jump in and get started. The first step in every Django project is figuring out the pieces of data we want to store. So what entities or concepts do we have in an e-commerce application? Well, for starters, we need the concept of a product with attributes like title, description, price, and inventory. Now, in a real scenario, a product entity might have other attributes. It really depends on the requirements of our application. For now, we just want to keep things simple, okay? Now, quite often, our products are divided in different categories like shoes, beauty products, fruits, and so on. So we need another entity called collection or category with an attribute called title. Now we need to add a relationship or an association between these entities so we can start from one end and navigate to the other end. For example, we can get a collection and find all the products in that collection, okay? Now, let's assume that in our application, a product can belong to one and only one collection, and a collection can have multiple products. So an asterisk represents many. We could also use an N here, okay? Now we have a one-to-many relationship between collection and product. So relationships can be one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. Back to our diagram. Now over here, we can add a label called products, and that means when we code these entities or these classes in the collection class, we're going to have an attribute called products. For now, I just want to hide this for simplicity, okay? Now, sometimes we can have multiple relationships or multiple associations between two entities. So let's imagine that a collection can optionally have a featured product. That is the product whose picture we want to show to the user. So we can add a second relationship between these entities. Now look at this number here. 0 to 1 means a collection can have 0 to 1 product, and we're going to call that attribute featured product. So once again, that means in the collection class, we're going to have an attribute called featured product, okay? Now you might ask, what about the ID attribute? Shouldn't every entity have an ID attribute? Yes, but Django is going to automatically create that for us. That's why I haven't shown it here. Now a little exercise for you. Grab a piece of paper and identify the other essential entities we need in an e-commerce application. Just the bare minimum. Don't go ahead and create a complex diagram like this. I don't want this. There are only 5 entities that I want you to identify. So spend a couple minutes and identify these entities along with the attributes and relationships. Then come back see my solution. All right, so this is what we ended up with in the previous lesson. We have a one-to-many relationship between collections and products. Now, don't take this as a hard and fast rule. Maybe in your application, a product can belong to many collections. Then you're going to have a many-to-many relationship between products and collections, okay? So back to our model. I'm going to remove the collection from here so we have some free space on the screen. Now, what else do we need here? Well, in every e-commerce application, we have the concept of a shopping cart, right? So we're going to have an entity or a model or a class called cart with an attribute called created at. Let's assume that we need to know when each cart is created. So every now and then we can do a cleanup and remove carts that are 30 days old. I just made this up, but in a real scenario, you should always design your models based on the requirements of your project. Don't make up your own rules, okay? Now, we need a relationship or an association between products and carts because a cart can have multiple products and a product might be in different carts. So here we have a many-to-many relationship between products and carts. Now, sometimes the relationship between two entities can have attributes. For example, if a product is in a shopping cart, we need to know how many instances of that product we have in the shopping cart. So this relationship itself should have an attribute called quantity. So we're going to add a new entity here called cart item. Now look at the notation I've used to represent this concept. I've connected cart item to the relationship using a dashed line. That means cart item represents the relationship between these two entities, product and cart. This is what we call an association class. So cart item is an association class, okay? Now there's another way to show this. Instead of using an association class, we can add a relationship between cart and cart item because a cart might contain multiple items and an item belongs to one and only one cart. And similarly, we can add a relationship between product and cart item because each cart item represents a single product and a product might be referenced by many cart items. So here we have two one-to-many relationships between these entities. Now compare this with the association class notation. So we can either add a many-to-many relationship with an association class or two one-to-many relationships. It's a matter of personal preference, okay? So we're done with the shopping cart, but you might ask, what about the user or the customer that owns this cart? Where is that in the diagram? Well, I haven't connected cart with an entity like customer because we don't want to force people to register and log in before they can add products to their shopping cart, okay? So there is no relationship between carts and customers. So carts are essentially anonymous. Anyone can have a cart, whether they're anonymous users or registered customers, okay? So we're done with the cart. Now let's talk about customers. So our customer entity can have attributes like name, email, username, password, and so on. Now, for simplicity, I'm only showing name and email here. Now, a customer can have many orders, and each order belongs to one and only one customer. So we need a one-to-many relationship between customers and orders. Now, once again, the order entity might have multiple attributes. For now, we just want to know when this order was placed, okay? Now, an order can contain multiple products, and a product can be in multiple orders. So we have a many-to-many relationship between orders and products. And similar to the shopping cart example, this relationship itself needs attributes. So here we need another entity called order item with an attribute called quantity. That's our association class. Alternatively, we could add a relationship between order and order item because each order may contain multiple items, and each order item belongs to one and only one order. Similarly, an order item references one and only one product, while a given product might be referenced by multiple order items. So two one-to-many relationships. So these are the entities that I wanted you to identify. But to make this project more interesting, I decided to throw in one more entity, tag. Here we have a many-to-many relationship between products and tags. Because a product can have many tags, and a tag might be referenced by different products. We'll come back to this entity in the next lesson. So I told you that a Django project contains one or more apps, and just like the apps on your phone, each app in a Django project provides a specific piece of functionality. So that means each app is going to have its own data model. So in this lesson, we're going to look at a few different ways to organize our entities in different apps. One way is to have a single app called the store and drop all of our entities here. Now, we can bundle and distribute this app via pip, and this way anyone can install this app in their project and get all these models and the functionality around them. So next time we're working on an e-commerce project, we don't have to rewrite the same functionality over and over. We simply install this app in our project and write extra code for customization. Great, but there's a problem here. As this application grows and gets more complex, it gets bloated with too many things, like too many models, too many views, and other stuff. This is what we call a monolith, like a large, heavy piece of stone. So at some point, our application might become hard to understand, hard to maintain, and hard to reuse. It becomes like one of those remote controls with too many buttons. When designing these apps, we want to follow the Unix philosophy. So each app should do one thing and do it well. So here's another solution. We can break down this project into 4 small apps. The products app, which represents a product catalog. So here we're going to have 3 entities: product, collection, and tag. Then we're going to have the customers app for managing customers. We're going to have the shopping cart app for adding the shopping cart functionality, and the orders app for adding the ordering functionality. Not bad, right? Well, this is actually a poor way of breaking down this project for a number of reasons. Look at the coupling or dependency between these apps. The orders app is dependent on the shopping cart app, which is dependent on the products app. So next time we're working on an e-commerce project, we'll have to install all these apps one by one. First, we have to install the products app, followed by the shopping cart app, the customers app, and the orders app. Ideally, each app should be self-contained so we can easily drop it into a new project. The other problem is that if we publish a new version of the products app, that might cause a breaking change in the shopping cart and subsequently orders apps. So anyone using these apps have to upgrade all these apps together. Again, more and more work. Also, it doesn't really make sense to have the shopping cart functionality without having a product catalog, right? Why would we ever want to add the shopping cart functionality to a project without a product catalog? So shopping cart functionality and product catalog always go together. By the same token, why would we ever want to add the shopping cart functionality to a project without the ability to place an order? Just to allow people to add something to their shopping cart? Then what? Again, it doesn't really make sense. So these concepts are highly related and should be bundled together. If we separate them, We increase coupling between apps and we end up with the problems I just talked about. So does it mean we have to go back to the monolithic design? No, there is a middle ground here. Look at the tag entity. The ability to tag products is optional. We don't necessarily need it in every e-commerce application. In fact, we might need it in other types of applications like a blog or video platform and so on. So tagging is not specific to products or an e-commerce application. It's a separate piece of functionality. So I'm going to move the tag entity to a separate app called tags. And here we're going to have another entity called tagged item, which represents an item that is tagged. It can be a product, an article, a video, and so on. It's an abstract concept. Now, with this separation, each app is self-contained and provides a specific piece of functionality. So we can use either or both of them in a new project depending on what we're going to build. Plus, we have zero coupling between these apps, so we can independently change and deploy them without affecting other apps. This is the proper way to break down this project into multiple apps. So here's the takeaway. If our app boundary is so large, we'll end up with a monolith that gets bloated and becomes hard to reuse. On the other hand, if our app boundaries are so small and fine-grained, we'll end up with a lot of coupling between them. A good design is one with minimal coupling and high cohesion, meaning high focus. So each app is focused on a specific piece of functionality and includes everything needed to fulfill that piece of functionality. Okay? So back to VS Code, we're going to create two new apps. So we run Python manage.py start app. The first app is store and the second one is tags. Okay? Now, as I told you before, every time we create a new app, we should add it in the list of installed apps. So let's close this window and go to our settings module. Here's the list of installed apps. I'm going to add those apps right here. So store and tags. All right, we're done with this step. Starting from the next lesson, we're going to create the model classes for these apps. Hey guys, Mosh here. I just wanted to let you know that this tutorial you have been watching is actually the first hour of my Ultimate Django course. The complete course is about 10 hours and goes way beyond this tutorial. So if you're serious about learning Django and are looking for a job as a backend developer, I highly encourage you to enroll in the course. The course comes with tons of exercises and solutions, a full e-commerce project that you will eventually deploy to the cloud, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee and a certificate of completion you can add to your resume. In case you're interested, I've put the link down below. So thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the course.